Welcome to another lab. In this lab, we are going to get started with Google Cloud Datastore. So we're going to deploy an App Engine application written in Python and backed by Google Cloud Datastore. We'll get that up into App Engine, we'll put some data into it, and we'll see some of the things we can do to manage and work with Datastore inside of the developer console. And we'll also take a look at some code to see how to write code against the Datastore. Let's begin. Now you can find the lab materials here at content.gcptrain.org. Head into Google Cloud Platform Fundamentals, and on the right-hand side, we're going to be working with Module 9, the lab here called Getting Started with Cloud Datastore. Also, don't forget, you have the lab code download that contains all of the code for the guestbook application across all these products, as well as the lab commands reference file that you can use to copy and paste the commands we'll be doing for things like deploying the application. I have the lab doc here locally ready to go. So again, we're going to work with an App Engine app here, our guestbook application. It's written in Python. And this time it's going to use Cloud Datastore to store the application data. So we'll deploy this to App Engine, we'll work with it, and then we'll take a look at how to manage the data store there in the developer's console. And of course, I will as well walk you through some code. So the first thing we're going to do is clone the project. Once we're done getting that, we will deploy it up to App Engine, and then we're going to get up into the developer console and just navigate around the data store area and show you some of the things that we can do with the data store to view our entities and to view our indexes and to do some general administration functions. This lab will take you about 20 to 25 minutes to do. Let's jump over to the developer console and get going. So the first thing we'll need to do is get access to an SDK. Again, you can use Cloud Shell for this, or you can head over to Compute Engine and use our CP100 Labs instance where we installed the SDK earlier in the course. So I'm going to do that, and then I will SSH into it from Cloud Shell. So we're just going to click on the Labs instance there and hit start to fire it up. All right, our Labs instance is ready to go. Let's do a gcloud compute SSH and the name of our instance, CP100-Labs. We will SSH onto this machine through Cloud Shell. Type in the zone where that instance lives, and now we are on it. So the first thing we're going to do is clone that Git repository that contains our project, and I will just do a git clone followed by the URL to that repo. All right, so that's going to load that up locally on our labs machine, and now we can switch directories right to that repo. Now, if we take a look inside of there, you'll see that it has all of the same files that we had with our original App Engine application, except we have another one in here called index.yaml that contains the index definitions that our queries are going to use to retrieve the data inside of the data store. In fact, app.yaml is completely unchanged since our App Engine lab. Index.html, same thing, completely unchanged. The only thing that's really changed here is guestbook.py. All that memcache code has been replaced with data store code. And we'll take a look at that here shortly. First, let's deploy this app up into App Engine by running an appconfig.py with the A switch so we can replace the application ID that's inside of app.yaml, and we'll run the update command passing in the directory, the current directory that we're in. That'll read our app.yaml file to drive this deployment. And we also need to put a no auth local web server so we can do all of our authentication here through the command line. Now, one thing to note is that our app.yaml file has version 1 in it. So this is actually going to overwrite the version 1 application that you have currently deployed in App Engine. So if you want to keep all these versions up in App Engine for all the different labs that we're going to do, then you can head into app.yaml and change the version whatever you want. And you can actually have text in there as well. So you could put 1-app engine, 1-datastore, 1-whatever, so you can track all the versions across all these labs that you were doing if you want to keep them up there and work with them after you've done these labs. So let's go ahead and do this deployment. Oh, and cool, look at that. We didn't have to authenticate. We're still authenticated from our previous lab, so we're good to go. So that deployed it, and it overwrote my version 1. So if we head over to App Engine, and we head over to versions, this is the default version is now this brand new version backed by the data store. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and delete version 2, so we just have version 1 in here that we're working with. All right, cool. Now, let's go back to the dashboard here, and let's just click right on this URL. Now, it's going to look the same as our previous lab, except that we're going to get something like this. What happened here? Now, what happened here, this is going to happen when you deploy an application because it's still building the index pages. See this? So it's going to take a little bit to build this. In fact, we can actually see this if we head into the data store, which I have pinned right here, so we can just click right there. And if we head over to indexes, we should now see this index, and it's going to be in a building state. Once that turns into a serving state, then our application will function. So see this? It's still preparing, and then it's going to go to building, and eventually it'll hit the serving status and we'll be good to go. We'll be able to reload our application and it'll load up. So once you deploy your application, you do need to wait for your indexes to build, because queries will fail if they have no index behind them. Just as exactly what we saw right here. That query, which when we hit our page ran a get, which ran a query to fetch those entities out of the data store, that index wasn't built. So the query said, oh, sorry, no index, can't get the data. All right, so I gave that just a second, and if we head back here, we can now see that our index is serving. So now we should be able to head back here, reload this, and it should hopefully work. Hey, there it is, it's working. All right, let's get some entries in here. How about, why hello, Cloud Datastore. And of course, we have to do this one, right? Datastore rocks. All right, we've got some entries in there. All right, let's head back to the console, and I'm just going to close out a Cloud Shell. We no longer need this, and let's head to the dashboard. Now, sometimes this won't reflect right away. Let's give it a little kick in the head here, see if this. Sometimes this helps, but hopefully it does this time. Yes, it does. Cool. So here it is. Here's our dashboard. You can do this for all kinds, or you can pick a specific kind, and we have just one kind in here called a greeting. And now, see this right here, wait for updates. We're not going to get this dashboard generated because it could take 24 to 48 hours to do so. But if we head into, this is a really nice dashboard, by the way, that breaks down all your entities, their storage, gives you nice pie charts, and just breaks everything down by data type and how much storage space they're taking up. So really nice statistics here in our dashboard. But if we head down to entities, we can actually see our entities. So we have two greeting entities here, one for each of the entries that we created. And you can query these by kind, so you have a really nice graphical user interface we can use here to filter. We can filter by a property, by the key or a property. These entities have two properties: content, which is the data we typed in, and date, which is auto-stamped with the date that that entity was created. Or we can also hit query by GQL, and we can type in some GQL queries to pull back specific entities to look at. So a great place to test your GQL here as well. But if we head back to query by kind here, and let's go ahead and choose one, this will take us into the details. So we can see that this entity is of type greeting, and here is its key. Now this key is actually another entity, but this isn't an entity that we create. We hard-coded it in code, and that's why you don't see it here inside of the Datastore viewer. So and I'll show you this when we get into the code, but essentially we make a guestbook entity with a name property, and the name is going to be default guestbook, and then we get the key off of this, and we make all of these other entities that we create, all these greeting entities, are children of this. That means we got strongly consistent access, and that's why as soon as we put an entry in here and we hit submit and it redirects us back and does a get, we immediately see that. If we didn't have that set up, if we weren't using an entity group, then eventual consistency means we may or may not have seen this when it did a redirect back to this page. Depends on how busy the data store is. But back to our entity, here are the two properties. There's our content, there's the data type, there's the value we typed in, and here is the date, and there is the auto-generated value, and both of these are indexed. Now, if we head back here, we should see that other one that we just entered in right there. Cool, there it is. So these are all greeting entities. Now, another thing you can do is administer the data store. You actually have to turn this on. So you enable Datastore Admin, which is going to allow you to do backups, restores, copies, and delete things in bulk. So a great way to just manage everything in one fell swoop. Let's look at some code. Heading into Sublime here are all the files for this project. Now, index.html hasn't changed at all except for one little tiny place, and that is right here. It's pulling out this specific property from our entity. App.yaml hasn't changed at all. Guestbook.py, however, has quite a bit. So we've got our relevant imports here. We're working with the NDB client library, which makes it very easy to work with Datastore from Python and model our entities. And then up here is our guestbook key. So here is where we're defining guestbook with the guestbook name, the default guestbook, and then we're getting the key from this entity. So again, this is all just kind of hard coded. And this is going to give us the key for this, which will just be the same key that we're going to use to tie our children greeting entities to our parent guestbook entity. Then we set up our Jinja environment, and here's where we model our entity. Very, very easy to do in Python. So we give it a name. That's going to be the name of the entity. And then we have our properties. So our content is going to be a string property. Our date is going to be a date time property. And we have auto add now to true, which will default that when this entity is created to the current date and time. Now, down here in our main page, anytime we do a get. In other words, whenever we access the page for the first time, whenever anybody refreshes, or whenever we add an entry, it's going to eventually redirect them. So on a post, it's going to redirect them back to our main page. Our get will get called. And the first thing it's going to do is set up a query. So it's going to do a greeting query, and we're going to perform an ancestor query here, which is going to say, give us all of the children underneath this key for that guest book, and then order them descending by the date of the greeting, so that date property. And this is why, if we look over at index.yaml, we have an index set up for our kind greeting. It is ancestor, it supports ancestor queries, and then our property there is on name, and the direction is descending. So that's how we define our indexes. And again, if you do this in a local development environment with App Engine, it's actually going to automatically build those for you inside of the Datastore indexes.xml file or index.yaml file in Python's case. From there, we're going to do a greetings query that we just set up there, .fetch, and grab the first 10 that it comes back with, which will be the most recent 10 entries, and stuff all those inside of a greetings variable, which will pass to the front end, and that's what it will then loop through those entries and render them as HTML. Whenever we do a post, in other words, we click that submit button to create a new entry, we're going to create a greeting object here, which is where we're going to use that model above, and again, specify the parent as the guest book key. So here's where we're setting up strong consistency, because this object or this entity that we're creating is going to have a parent entity based on that key. Then we're going to set the content property equal to the entry, which is the text area there in our front end, in our HTML page. And then the date will get auto-generated. Once we call a put, it's going to put that entity inside of the data store and then redirect here back to the main page. And then we also have our post here for clearing everything out. That is our second button right here, clear entries. So what that's going to do is this is actually going to do a key query, a key only query. So again, we set up a query, an ancestor query, and we're going to do a fetch by returning only the keys, a highly efficient query, because that's all we need in order to do a delete multi. We pass in an array of keys and it will delete all those entries based on the key. And then once again, once that's done, it'll redirect back to the main page. So working with the data store, not too bad, right? So we model our entities by defining their properties and their data types. We put them into the data store by creating objects out of them, filling them up, filling those properties up with data, put them in the data store, and then we retrieve them by running queries. And here we're defining our queries in an object-oriented nature using the NDB client library. But you can certainly, they have methods on here that support running raw GQL as well. Now, there is no cleanup for this lab. However, if you did use that labs instance, head into Compute Engine. Don't forget to put a checkbox next to that instance and hit stop to turn it down, as I did. In this CBT Lab Nugget, we saw to get started with Google Cloud Datastore. We deployed our App Engine app, which is our guestbook application written in Python, only this time backed by the Datastore, up into GCP. Put some data into it and saw how we could manage the Datastore layer of our application up there in the developer console. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.